Great, so I'm gonna get started then. Um, so for those of you who were here yesterday, I'm gonna pick up sort of where I left off in this theme of what happens when AI makes everything works the same. How should you feel about that, and what sort of markets does that create? I kind of want to tie into some of the conversations we've been having so far. We talk a lot about algorithmic filtering from the sort of recommender system side. And I think that is the delivery side of what's going on, or the consumption side of what people experience is coming a lot from algorithmically generated sources. But increasingly, you're seeing the production side being algorithmified. So there's an app called Pika. This is actually the wrong logo. Apparently a Pika is a small rodent, and there's an app called Pika Patrol that allows you to go spot Pikas out in the wild and post them to social media. This is a different app also called Pika. And what they do is they help you create AI generated
golden stalk.
What?
It doesn't label call your golden stalk.
Oh, really?
Never.
Well, it is now an app with at least thousands, if not millions of users that allows you to generate AI videos using AI, post them to social media, and gain traffic that way. Okay. And so an increasing fraction of what we see is now AI generated online. You can find lots of stories and recrimination about how this is bad, how this is all slop. There's a bunch of stories actually about the people behind this. So who is out there creating AI generated content for Facebook? There's some especially sad stories about how communities are getting destroyed in some way by AI onslaught. So for example, there's a houseplant community on Reddit where people will post pictures of their plants and say, here's how you care for it. And they're becoming quite useless because you're getting a lot of incorrect AI generated advice showing up on the sites and you just don't know what to trust and believe anymore. So what's the story here? You might view this as a quality story. So the quality of stuff online is going down because it's all AI generated slop. I don't think I have the best taste in the world, so I don't want to sit here and be the one saying that, slop is a quality problem. I also don't really consider social media content to be high quality in general, but this is mostly a personal thing. And so to me, maybe the story is about quality, but it's less clear to me. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that, at least from a revealed preferences perspective, and we can talk about whether we agree with that perspective or not, people are consuming, right? It's not like slop is out there, it's getting zero engagement, but somehow companies are pushing it anyway. It's actually kind of the opposite, that there's a certain type of slop and a certain class of consumer where there's actually a pretty good match there. And people are very happy to spend a lot of time scrolling through slop. And so you could say that actually that there's an engagement story here. This is from an expose where they interviewed a bunch of people who basically their day job now is they'll go to ChatGPT and say, give me some prompts for images that I can then post to Facebook. They should all be kind of on this theme. And so this guy specializes in images of Jesus. And so he said, give me a bunch of image generation prompts that are going to get me a lot of engagement. He'll generate a bunch of stuff like this. And then he'll just post them to Facebook. Lots of people will like and share, and he will get some amount of revenue from this because he gets a lot of engagement and traffic. Okay, so there's a story in which this is giving people what they want, and maybe this is good, maybe this is bad, unclear.
Just ask, and I'm sorry if you covered this yesterday, but when I hear the word slop, I think of a value judgment as kind of like that, right? Yeah. Not something someone wants to see. So is there a specific definition of slop you're using here?
Not really. It's sort of a pejorative for AI generated content more generally. I think I view it as there is a segment of consumer who enjoys it, and there's a segment of consumer who looks down on it. That latter segment of consumer will call it slop. And the former segment of consumer just doesn't really care, and they'll consume it because that's what's in front of them.
But just any AI generated content.
Yeah, I mean, I will make the case that one way to think about slop in some sense is actually excess similarity and homogeneity across an ecosystem as opposed to an individual piece of content level.
When you say there's a group of people who don't care,
yeah,
are those people who know it's AI generated and don't care, or are those people who may not be aware that it's AI generated and may care if they didn't know?
Great question. So a couple things. In general, no, they may not know that it's AI generated, and there aren't really required disclosures around that kind of stuff. And two, there's evidence that when you tell people stuff is AI generated, they react more negatively to it. And so I don't know if these particular people would care about stuff that they're seeing like on Facebook, but also on other platforms. But yeah, so maybe they would care, maybe they wouldn't, they probably don't, or many of them don't know.
But I mean, presumably the fraction of people who think this is an actual photo of Jesus is also pretty small.
Yeah. So this particular photo, I think we can agree that like everybody knows that this is not real, but like a big category of AI generated content that people like is like videos of cats and dogs and babies playing with each other, or like animals doing weird things. And a lot of that stuff people don't realize is AI generated.
Do you have evidence that it's homogenizing? I mean, because we've discussed about it already a bit, right? But it could be the opposite, right? It's all like individually customized. Everybody gets to see whatever they want.
It's a good question. There's some evidence on this, so like it's hard to know. It's hard to know if this is an artifact of, some people have found a recipe that works for them and they're just kind of running the same playbook over and over again, versus different people are kind of converging to the same production pattern because that's actually what the market wants. There's anecdotally, you see a lot of places in which homogeneity is showing up. So for example, this guy, Neil Clark, he runs a sci-fi magazine that he takes submissions from the public. And he basically had to close off submissions because he was getting a bunch of AI generated submissions and they all had the same kind of formulaic recipe. Right, there's 2250 something, Earth's environment is about to collapse, only 3 scientists can save us.
I think on a priori grounds, I would think like if say the limit when the production cost of content goes to 0 and they have a lot of information about everybody can produce, then my goal is to get engagement of some form or other. I would think what would result of that is like individualized content.
Good. So there's a model of the world in which I can produce arbitrary content with AI. That's not the model of the world that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a model of the world where the technology actually steers you in a particular direction. And that is the force that actually leads to some amount of homogenization. Is I cannot create arbitrary stuff. I can create stuff that is easy to produce with AI, but that is a subset of the universe of all possible content.
I don't want to derail you more, but I found the most interesting detail about your previous anecdote was that the prompts were themselves generated with AI.
Yeah.
Which I think kind of supports the notion that like the cheapest content is the one where you just let the AI cook, and that's kind of what creates the homogenization. Like you could come up with different prompts to get a more diverse set of AI output, but that's costly.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not going to talk, again, to your question from yesterday, I'm not going to talk about cost today. There's a story where you could rewrite the entire model that I'm going to talk about today, under which you spend more in order to get farther away from the sort of nucleus of what AI is doing. Okay, so today I'm going to try to do a few things. I generally want to talk about production of sort of high dimensional freeform content and the homogeneity that we're starting to see. And try to get some sense of like, where is this all headed? Do we have some ability to steer it? The two main questions or sort of phenomena that I'm going to talk about are, one, empirically across a bunch of studies, including the one I'm going to talk about today, AI does seem to homogenize production. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. And then two, how would you situate that in a market and try to understand what long-term equilibria look like, as opposed to currently on Facebook, everything kind of looks the same, but maybe currently on Facebook is not a long-run equilibrium. Okay, and there's going to be a combination of a study that one of my students, Nathan Joe, ran recently, which with some very cool results, and then I'll try to motivate a theory model that describes all. So hopefully there's something in here for everyone. We're going to talk about an RCT, we'll talk about a theory model, and then if you like experiments with large language models, we will have some of that. Okay, so I'll go back to remind you of some of the conversation that we had yesterday. Empirically, there's all of these studies that basically say language models and sort of generative models more generally tend to make content more homogeneous. So you can do this in multiple choice settings and you see some models agree with each other, perhaps more than you would expect. You see this kind of more starkly in free-form, open-ended tasks like creative writing and ideation, some amount of art. You see this a lot actually in trying to simulate survey responses. Like one of the big challenges if you're trying to use LLMs to do market research or simulate survey participants is that they kind of give you the same few things over and over, and they don't represent the full diversity of viewpoints that people might have. a typical setup, side note, this is an AI generated image. If you have been grading student reports over the last 2 years, you will be very familiar with this particular format of image because this is exactly the kind of style of image that you get when you ask Claude to make a diagram of something. Every single one, I teach an MBA class, all of the reports that I got had some version of like this plot, right? So it's a funny point seeing in my own life. So there's a class of studies that look kind of like this, that say, we are going to run an RCT on some creative task. In this particular case, it's creative ideation. This is one of the prompts that they actually use. How could you make a stuffed toy animal more fun to play with? And half of the participants get access to ChatGPT in this particular case. Half of them are in a control group. This particular control group actually had access to a deck of cards called Oblique Strategies that is meant to like prompt you to think in creative ways. But it's designed by humans. It's like 80 cards in a deck. And they say things like think laterally on it. Okay, and so then you run these participants through a few of these questions and ask them for ideas, basically what are some creative ideas you have, and you log things like what are the ideas they had, how long does it take them to do it, and then you just compare some metrics, right? So how different are the ideas from them? How many ideas did each individual participant come up with? And the basic result structure that you see for a lot of these studies is that individual productivity goes up, collective productivity goes down. And this is not the only study that'll give you a finding like this. It's fairly easy to replicate. And in fact, I'm going to show you in a second that we did replicate a version of this. Okay. Now, my intuition when I first saw this particular study and a bunch of studies like this was effectively that I believe that you can make this happen in a lab setting. But it's less clear to me that this is going to be, like, is this a good predictor of what the market for creativity on, let's say, Facebook or whatever is going to look like? And if not, why not? Right? And to me, the natural conclusion was something like, in this particular setup, I don't care that my idea was the same as my neighbor's idea. My compensation did not change based on whether or not we had the same idea. And therefore, I'm very happy to take whatever idea ChatGPT gave me and submit that. But if we're thinking about the use of AI in a social media market where we're actually competing with one another for engagement, or the use of AI for scientific hypothesis generation and ideation, again, I don't want to be generating the same hypotheses as Max. I want to be thinking about something different. And so again, there are externalities in that kind of market. Okay. And so for those reasons, you may believe that these studies won't necessarily generalize in the long run. Clear so far what the hypothesis is? And so step one, well, actually step three, but step one was write down a theory model, which I'll tell you about later. But what ended up being step three, which I'm going to describe as step one, is do the experiment that basically validates this hypothesis that says, let's say we actually change the incentive structure. Do we see these results? Do they continue to persist? So the intuition that Nathan and I went into this lab study with is that participants just fundamentally don't care enough about your lab studies. It's not a matter of the amount of compensation. It's the thing that you were compensated for, right? Completion is not the same thing as succeeding in a market. And so the hypothesis that we set out to test is actually, let's change that as a condition in our study, that some people are going to be rewarded just for completion and some people will be rewarded relative to their peers. And we'll just see what changes in those two ways. Okay, so this is the experiment we ran. It was a 2x2 where half the participants get AI, half the participants don't. And then across that, half of them are graded on the technical quality of the story that they write, and half of them are told that they're going to be graded on standing out among their peers or originality. Yeah.
Just to clarify, for the previous study, there were no incentives on any dimension for the task?
So they're incentivized to complete the task.
Just completion.
But the incentives are in isolation, as in your behavior does not affect my compensation at all. Right? And so I'm going to claim that that is the fundamental limitation about being able to generalize from these types of studies. Okay. And the thing that we're going to measure, which you can take issue with, and I sort of take issue with a little bit, but I don't know if I have a better solution than this, is so we're going to get people to generate short stories. And we're going to look at the vector embeddings of the stories, run them through some embedding model, we get some pointed high dimensional space, and just look at, in that high dimensional space, how similar the stories are to one another.
Isn't everything far away from each other in that space?
In Euclidean distance, yes. In terms of cosine similarity, no.
But that's kind of by itself striking, right? I mean,
It's sort of true by nature of the way that these, like, these embedding models are designed to capture similarity, and they have like, I don't know, there's probably like a 400 dimensional space that these things are being embedded in, and they have to be able to sort of assign meaningful embeddings to any possible sequence of like reasonably long text. Right?
kind of nobody uses screen in like 400 dimensional space.
So again, if it was raw Euclidean distance, yes, everyone would have like roughly the
But
same.
it doesn't matter, it's just distance on the sphere, no?
Yes, but now you're projecting down into this like two-dimensional plane every single time, and it ends up being sort of. I'll show you actually what the raw numbers look like, and it ends up being coherent.
Yeah, and participants know that this is the measure for originality.
Correct.
At some level.
So here's the literal words. There are thousands of submissions. Your goal is to stand out as much as possible. In other words, your bonus will be determined based on the originality.
But so you could write in French and arguably that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
None of them did, but.
How many submissions did you have?
200, so 50 in each condition.
What if you generate a random sequence? Sorry. Okay.
It's not deception. This is actually how we grade it down.
No, but
The thousand.
the thousands is,
Oh, that might be deception, yeah.
yeah,
Just all you and IRB,
okay.
they were okay with it.
A different discipline.
Wait, sorry, did we say thousands?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, we did say.
But different disciplines have different thresholds for like, whether deception is fine or not, so it's just. Yeah, it's interdisciplinary.
What if they had submitted a random sequence of words?
It would have done very well according to this embedding based measure, but the embedding based measure is not actually what we use for grading. We grade it just by region.
Yes, so why did you pick creative writing as the task rather than what the people did in the experiment before?
It's a good question. Yeah,
I
sorry.
think average pairwise similarity doesn't seem to be a very good measure of like originality in many ways.
Yeah, so
So maybe with the other exercise that would have picked up more in kind of originality, if it's like a more structured exercise.
in some sense, we were worried that about imposing too much structure. And I view this as like pairwise similarity of short stories is already kind of a weak measure. And if you can move the needle on that weak measure, that would convince me that like if I did this in an even more structured setting, it would be easy to detect effects. And so the punchline I'm going to show you is you can detect effects here, and I'll show you sort of mechanistically what's going on. But I view this as like one way of making the point, not a sort of conclusive evidence that this is going to happen to everyone. Okay, good. So the hypotheses that we pre-registered are one, consistent with all the prior work on this, that you would see higher pairwise similarity when people had AI versus not. And two, when people know that they are being graded for standing out, you will see lower pairwise similarity than when they think they're just being graded for completion. Okay, so this you should view as like confirming what lots of prior studies have found, and this is the actual hypothesis that we think is novel and interesting.
Did you have a hypothesis about the interaction?
Do we have what?
Did you have a hypothesis about the interaction between the two?
No. No, but I'll show you what the interaction looks like.
Yeah, not to push on that, but just to understand sort of in light of the pangram discussion that we had yesterday, if you took two AI generated texts, is there reason to believe that they have higher cosine similarity than an AI and a human text, sort of regardless of the contents of the story?
Probably.
Is that not a problem?
It would be a problem if this was the primary thing that we cared about. This is the primary thing that we really care about here, and both of these are AI. We also do, so because we control the entire interface, one really nice thing about the data that we have here is not only do we have the final thing that they wrote, we have their entire transcript of conversation with, in this case, there's a GPT backend that we just built into it. But so we see the entire transcript and we can see like what fragments of the text are actually attributable to things that the AI said / wrote versus what is attributable to the user. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like. Okay, so this is kind of what the interface looks like for the people who have access to AI. They have, there's a story they're writing, they can type a message in here, they can copy stuff back and forth and so on. We did get everyone to brainstorm without AI before they did this, in part to try to see a little bit more diversity into what they were saying so they wouldn't sort of everybody get exactly the same first draft for AI. I think you can see even more AI similarity if you took this step away. But we thought we'd rather include it that way. And again, we observe both the editing trajectory. So we have like 5-second snapshots of what is in this box. And then we see the entire chat transcript here. Okay, so this is high level result number 1.
Yeah. Clarifying question.
Yeah.
The control group, you said AI versus not.
Yes.
What is not? Like, is it
This is gone. They just do not have an
And do they have-
interface there.
And do they have access to the internet? Or what is it?
Good, okay, so we can talk about this more. One of the things that Nathan built into this was really, really strong attention checks.
Mhm.
Like had to be full screen, couldn't leave that browser window, couldn't be inactive for too long at a time. Just to prevent people having like side use of AI, basically. I think it worked, and if it didn't work, I don't think you would have seen the results that we see. But I think it's getting increasingly hard. There was a study that was done a few months later looking at like, we put a task on Prolific, what fraction of people just like were using AI on it, and the answer was not that high actually, it was like under 10%. So I'm not super worried about people cheating and using AI in the control.
I mean, I was just trying to think of the status quo and how I should think about, because in the base study that the other paper, it was like all manual and nothing. Is that how we should think of the no AI status quo?
I think so. I mean, all manual in the sense that this is all they get and they're just
Here,
typing.
yes,
Yeah.
but it's like, for a relevant benchmark, you also have the internet and a lot of information there.
Yeah, okay, great. So again, most of what I care about is not actually the comparison with the control. It is the within AI group comparison. So like, in a sense, you should view this as like very confirmatory of prior work. Okay, so main sort of result number 1. So here's how you should view this. This is like average cosine similarity between a random pair of essays submitted under a particular condition. You can see that here's the first draft that people generated with AI, which of course only exists for the AI condition. They're basically the same and they're very high average pairwise similarity. By the time they submit, they have actually edited quite a bit and separated out so the similarity goes down. You can see there's sort of like barely clearance between the confidence intervals here. So, we had roughly the correct power on our experiment size here. And you can see that basically there's no difference across the 2 control conditions. Average pairwise similarity much lower and similar across it didn't really matter what the incentive structure was, but the incentive structure between these 2 conditions does appear to make a difference. Yeah.
It's interesting that the humans can respond to the original set. I wouldn't call that something I would have obviously predicted.
So I want to be careful. It's not that they're not responding to the incentive. It is that whatever response to the incentive they have is not moving the needle on this particular measure. And so there can be some divergence between those.
But I mean, it's interesting that they could, if they started, I think, with an AI written draft, things that would make it more differentiated.
Correct.
Why you are getting a separation between blue dots.
Yeah.
Well, it's starting with a human draft, they were seemingly unable. I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a good explanation for why there's no obvious separation between these. Okay, right, thanks here, yeah.
Would the alternative interpretation be that they're original anyway?
So they are original anyways. I guess the question is like, could they be more original? And to Ben's point, I guess the answer is like, not according to this particular measure. But again, maybe if we read them manually, we would sort of flag them as, yeah, actually this is more original than this sort of group of essays. That's sort of harder for me / a grad student to go through 50 essays and say like, collectively, these are more novel than collectively these 50 essays over here. So this is the best measure that we have.
But you said you got human assessment for that incentive, right?
Correct, but not in an absolute sense. So we can say like, these are the top 5% of essays in this batch. It's much harder to say like, these 50 essays are collectively more original than these 50 essays.
But you won't show us the numbers on what share for each group is in the top 5 or whatever.
Well, we just pick the top 5% in this group, but like 5% of the essays are in the top 5.
But sorry, I don't get that. Like, how does the incentive then work? How do I get a reward for being original if I use AIT? CIO.
Sorry, so this is the O is the one where we took the top whatever percent threshold of them and then gave bonuses for those. And then this one, everybody just got the same.
Oh, I see, and you don't have the assessment for those.
Correct.
Yeah, just on my earlier point, so the headline result is that the brown dots are lower than the blue dots, right?
No, the headline result, so
If
brown
one of
dots,
them-
these being lower than these is like what we expected to see given prior work.
But within is the interesting.
Correct, within these two is the sort of novel hypothesis here.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so because you said you have the whole transcript of the conversation, is the like in the originality group, is it coming a lot from people telling the AI to not sound like AI? And how much is it that humans actually intervene because they think originality requires me to add something special?
Good. Yeah, I will try to answer that question with lots in a second.
Okay.
But yeah, that's the right question to be asked.
Quick, it is like after final submission, like
Mhm.
between the first draft and final submission.
Yeah.
I think similar to your, like, is it like it is that I try to make the wording unique?
Yeah,
The idea is still, we have the same idea, I just try to make the wording closer to,
yeah.
because that's the thing.
It's a good question. I don't quite know how to quantitatively answer that question. I can show you, so this is sort of the time spent, so Nathan classified all these sort of progressions over time as either like editing what's already there or writing a new draft and sort of pasting that in. And so like the time spent drafting things from scratch goes down right around here, and then most of it is just editing the work that you already have. And you can see sort of this is just filling the gap from these points to these points. They start out quite self-similar, and then it sort of diverges a little bit by this-ish point in time. You could re-squint at this and say, okay, this is probably coming from the editing, not the drafting side of the things here, but I don't think it's enough data to really be able to make strong statements, and it's not really powered to be able to make strong statements of that form. Okay, and then the last thing I think that gave me a little bit more sort of confidence in these results and sort of mechanistically what we were seeing is, so you can do like a principal components plot of the embedding space here. So what you see is like the colors are all the same here. The X's are first drafts, the squares are like sort of the third-ish draft coming out of AI, and then the circles are the final things that they submitted. You notice that these first drafts all kind of live in one part of the space. And actually they share a lot of really common features in wording. So like a bunch of these start with I am, name of character, description of personality and motivation. Many of them, a surprising number of them just start with the phrase I woke up doing something, right? So that's sort of like a hallmark of the way that this particular AI model chooses to write stories. And just very visually, you can see that they're all sort of in a different part of the space and clustered tightly together.
How should I think about the magnitudes here? Like, we touched upon this like yesterday also.
Yeah.
Online, offline, I don't remember, but it's like, you know, if I look at this visually, yes, they're statistically different, but
should I care? Is it
yeah,
actually-
like,
Yeah, so I don't have a good sense of like how to think about magnitudes. I do think the best sort of qualitative evidence I can give you is the fact that there's like common phrasing throughout these first drafts. And that seems to, I should have shown on this plot, that seems to disappear as people do this editing, right? So I don't know. I don't know how to interpret like 0.4 versus 0.28 as the average pairwise similarity. All we can really say are these are relative comparisons that we make, but I don't know how to interpret them on any absolute scale.
actually, if a reviewer asks you, you could do a different depth here, right? It's like between the blue plots. And like the dark blue is slightly lower than the light blue initially, and then it sort of almost flips. That might.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway, that's too meta.
I think we have a small-ish amount of data here, so I feel good about the things that we pre-registered, and then we can say that those things bore out. Everything else is just like, yeah, we can torture the data to say lots of things, and I will do that in a second. Or something. But I want you to take it with appropriate grains of salt.
And you're gonna filter what you're gonna tell us about them.
Yeah.
I might have missed this, but the human validation is not on pairs of stories, but.
Correct. On each one in isolation. Or I mean, when we actually had to go sit down and like assign dollar values to this originality condition, then we had to just sort of pick the best couple stories and assign dollar values to those. But that was sort of completely separate from the metrics that we're using here.
But that might help with interpretability, like just to sort of see how humans are feeling about stories that are closer.
Yeah, I think maybe the answer to a lot of these questions is Nathan has read all of the stories, and so he has like just a much better intuition for what the differences are, what they mean. I think from what he told me, the only thing that really stands out is like he noticed that they were all starting with the same phrases just by reading a bunch of them. Maybe there's some other stuff that he noticed in there as well, but not everything is so easily noticeable just from this sort of size of sample.
But like, at least within the originality condition, you could validate the human assessment across the cosine similarity, right? See how correlated.
Yeah, so you could say like, are the things that are ranked best by, in this case, Nathan, also the things that diverge from like the sort of average, have the highest average pairwise distance? I don't actually know, we haven't analyzed that. Okay, I'm gonna hint at what I think is the mechanism here, but again, this is all sort of post hoc analysis, so you should take it with a grain of salt. Because we have these transcripts, we can just basically say like what fraction of the text that they submitted was AI generated as it came from the transcript versus what fraction of it was human written, because it didn't come from AI in the transcript. And we can just look at that and call that an adoption rate, right? What fraction of the words are coming from AI. You can see that there's some people who have like fully AI generated stuff. Now that doesn't mean they didn't spend some time iterating on a prompt, going back and forth and, editing certain paragraphs by saying, delete this paragraph, rewrite it to say something, right? But all of the words that came out of this final submission were in fact given by AI. And there's some people who had the opposite, that 0% of the words in their final submission came out of the AI and it was all sort of typed out themselves manually. Okay. And kind of the mechanism that we think is going on here is basically being in this originality condition just decreases people's adoption or their reliance on AI. Like the actual raw text that is coming out of the AI models, they're just using less of it. And this kind of seems to be driving the results, or it's like a big enough effect that all of the results could be coming. Now, again, I don't know how to make causal claims about, or we couldn't try to make causal claims about this if we started out trying to do this. This is more of a post hoc discovery though. Yeah.
So if people just like paraphrase the AI output, is that gonna generate a meaningfully different cosine similarity, or do I actually need to kind of change the intellectual cosine?
Yeah, so this also goes back to the thing that I said yesterday, that cosine similarity is like a weird heuristic that combines both style and substance. And so to the extent that you change style, you will move the needle. Maybe not as much as if you change both style and substance, and I kind of don't know what the conversion rate is between those. There are embedding models that try to isolate style features as opposed to conflating them together. We didn't really see any sort of meaningful differences across those. Okay, so this is sort of my takeaway from this experiment, and just maybe this is just your intuition, that in a market where you are rewarded for differentiation, strategic behavior should mitigate some of this homogenization. And so what I'm going to try to do next is to generalize from this experiment and from this intuition that you might have into a formal model of what might be going on here, and say, what can we extrapolate? What parts of this are more general? What do we learn beyond the confines of this one particular study that we did? Okay, so I'll give you a formal model, a mathematical model of AI and why you get some sort of homogenization and how competition might influence that. Now, to do so, I'm going to use a word game called Scattergories as what I think of as a useful metaphor for what's going on here. So Scattergories is a game where it's a word game you play with your friends. You are given a letter in a category, and your goal is to come up with a word or phrase that starts with the target letter and meets that category. And it behaves like a market in that you are rewarded only if your response is both correct and unique. Okay, so not only are you trying to figure out what matches, you're trying to think about what everyone else might do and sort of strategically position yourself to do something that is unlikely. So you might see something that says like things with tails starting with an L, and you have to think of things with tails that start with an L, or famous actors starting with a B or something like that. Okay. And the reason I'm going to do this is it's very easy to run experiments where you actually just try to produce stuff with large language models and see what would happen if you had them play a game of Scattergories. What happens if you have them play this game of strategic differentiation? And so if you try doing this, you ask your favorite robot, what is something with a tail starting with an L, it'll say something like leap. Reasonably good answer. It actually says something, gives you slightly more information than that, right? It gives you sort of information about the entire distribution of potential responses here. So if you sample from it multiple times and you vary some of the sampling parameters, you can just elicit a full distribution of possible responses. So you get things like lemur, you'll get lion, you get leopard, you get a bunch of other stuff. Okay. And there are a few things that control this distribution. One is which model you choose to use. So you'll find that you actually get different distributions out of different models. Yeah.
That was when the AI did not know the rules they gave. That's just a example.
Oh, good. Yeah. So this is the full prompt is like, we're going to place categories. Here are the rules of the game. You're trying to be unique. You're trying to, yeah. So it has the full knowledge of the rules of the game. But you could choose not to, right? You could just choose to ask no context, give me something starting with an L. You have some control over how you ask the question. You have some control over what I call decoding parameters, which are these sort of technical things that control the literal distribution that you're going to get out. I'm going to refer to this as like sort of the conditions under which you're using this model. I'm going to call it theta. And as a brief aside, why do I think that this is a useful sort of playground to test this out? It sort of occupies this middle ground between, as you said, it might be nice if we had something more structured that isn't this full high-dimensional large story where it's easier to see sort of similarity in collisions. That's true. I think a lot of work skews in the other direction where it's like, we're going to make this a multiple choice problem. And that is, in my view, a little bit too restrictive to see some of the behaviors that we want. So this occupies a nice middle ground, in my view. Importantly, we do want to be able to eventually get, I'm not going to talk about how we do this or what they even look like, but you want to be able to get like reasonably good statistical guarantees about what you're doing here. That's really hard to do if you're operating in the space of like short stories. Okay. So one very easy way to control the sort of diversity of your distribution is to play with what's known as the temperature parameter. If you haven't seen this before, basically what happens is every time you sample the next token from a large language model, you're sampling from like the soft max of a bunch of logits that can be between negative infinity and infinity. And you have one little parameter that basically allows you to interpolate between a uniform distribution and a deterministic sample. So when you set that parameter to be 0, you get a deterministic sample. And that means this particular model, every time you sample it at that temperature, will give you the answer we need. Okay. As you start to turn that knob up, you get a more and more diverse distribution. And you can imagine if I'm in a game where I'm trying to sort of anti-coordinate with other people, I would like to be sampling from a more diverse, higher entropy distribution. So maybe I want some probability of saying lemur and some probability of saying
It's made up, or this is actually what?
This is true. This is what happens when you do llama 3.1, I think is the model behind this. And so you can keep turning this knob over and over. One thing that starts to happen is you get answers that are kind of invalid as you do this. So there is some sort of frontier between increasing the diversity of the distribution from which you're sampling and maintaining the one-shot quality of it. And this is kind of mechanically true. If you turn this temperature up to infinity, you're just getting a uniform distribution of the language. That's not going to be giving you valid answers very long, right? So there's some kind of frontier that you're tracing out just with this one little knob. You can do this for a while. You get things like ladybug in there. Ladybugs don't have tails. You get sort of nonsensical answers like lemons if you go out too far. And so there's some limit to how much you want to be doing this. But you can imagine that like this is a sort of toy model of how you might actually try to strategically differentiate is to sample from more and more sort of diverse distributions. Now, one thing you'll notice here is we are getting variability in the sense that we're getting different distributions, like literally different distributions. But actually, if you think of like the information content of this distributions as like the ranking over alternatives that they provide, we're not changing that dramatically, right? So even when I go out to this larger temperature, lemur, lion, lizards are still the top few answers that you get. That was true even if I sort of back up to a lower.
That mechanically has to be the case, right? If it's softmax.
Not necessarily, because these are multi-token responses. So if it's one token at a time, you're absolutely right. It does have to be monotonic. For longer responses, it need not be. Okay. You could say that like this is purely an artifact. I mean, maybe to your point here, like the way that the softmax works is it kind of preserves monotonicity, at least one token at a time. So this particular way that I have of getting more diverse distributions has this sort of shared ranking property, or nearly has a shared ranking property. So you could ask, if I use different prompts would I maybe get different rankings out of this? Because that's a different way I could try to sort of diversify my distribution. You could just say, what if I use a different language model altogether? If I use, a different model, would I get something other than lemur as a top response? Right, so they have like different information content in different models. And it is possible to elicit different information from the same models by changing some other parameters.
I don't know how the model works technically enough to ask this question, but if you wrote it down as a game and the humans were playing, it looks like a game where you would want a mixed strategy equilibrium.
Good.
Is the model capable of that?
I mean, in the sense of like, what does a mixed strategy mean here? Like everything is a distribution. So literally my strategy could be sample randomly from this model at temperature 1.5, and this is my mixed strategy. Right, it's a mixture over discrete responses. Every time I play the game, I'll get a different one. And we are actually going to write down exactly that game in a second.
Right, but there's a different sense in which like the model could say my strategy would be this distribution.
Yeah, okay, so that is a harder thing to empirically do, and so I'm not doing it.
Then the answer would be like a uniform distribution.
So the right answer is like a uniform distribution over correct answers, right? That's the sort of right equilibrium to have here. That is very hard for a model to write down or to sample from, as we're going to see in a second. And so I think this is where I'm trying to get at. If you idealize a model as capable of doing absolutely anything, you don't get any of these homogenizing forces. Like this is not a property of competition in games generally, but it does seem to be empirically a property of the language models that we have today. And so what I'm going to try to do is basically write down a model that says, where is the limitation? What is the difference between an idealized language model that's capable of doing anything versus the models that we have today? How do you actually write down that structure difference between them, and what kind of conclusions can you draw? I don't think it's the only way of writing this down, nor do I think it's necessarily going to last forever. You should view this as like empirically something is happening. I would like to be able to write down a theory model that generates those same phenomena, and we can argue about whether it's the right theory model.
Just make sure I again understand the question that we're asking. So it seems unlikely that the AI would think linear is the least likely answer.
Correct.
And so is it I'm playing a game and I have to give a reasonable answer for other people to have a go? Is that what it thought it was doing? Because I mean, one thing it should be able to know is systematic. It's obviously not going to be linear. It's not the best answer. But what
section that says that you can do all sorts of things to change sort of the precise distribution that you get, but you can't fundamentally alter the ranking over alternatives that it provides. In some sense, like it thinks answer A is the best. You can't change its mind about the fact that answer A is the best. It thinks that B is the second best. That's going to persist no matter what. And to do that, what I'm going to do is actually provide you some evidence that this is sort of largely true here. Again, even in this relatively simple setting, you can't really, or I can't really get these models to go far outside of that. Yeah, right around here is perfect. Yeah, thanks so much. Good. So where did I leave off? We were somewhere here. Okay, yeah. So the next thing that I'll try to convince you of is, this temperature parameter, despite the fact that it changed the distribution around, it didn't actually change the information content in some sense. You could try a different version of this that says, let's say just ask nicely, ask in a different way, ask it to really think hard about what other people are going to do and then give me something different. Is that going to change the information content? And so I can come up with a different way. I can rewrite the prompt, make it completely different. Again, in a model of LLMs as completely idealized objects, this could do arbitrary things to the information or the distribution that I'm getting. Right? There's no a priori reason to expect that what I get when asking this way is going to be the same as what I get when asking that way. But my hypothesis is actually that that's not going to make that much of a difference. And in fact, like no matter really how you ask, the variability that you get within an LLM is actually quite small. Now, to your question earlier, I don't know how to say small in any absolute sense. So I'm going to try to benchmark this in a sort of relative way. What I'm going to say is you can change out the prompt, you can change out the temperature, you can do all this stuff. That's going to have much smaller effects than just like swapping to a different language. And that's going to be my benchmark for what I mean by small. Now, is that smaller than human variability? Is that, I don't know, right? You have to do that separately. And so precisely what I mean by this is if I ask a model the same thing in two different ways, I should get kind of the same ranking over alternatives. If I ask a different model the same thing in two different ways, I should get that different ranking of alternatives. These are kind of the same, and going across models is the same. That's my hypothesis here, and thankfully it's a very testable one.
Can I think out loud through this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right, so if I think of what that LLM does, right, the most studied version of it is in some sense a probability distribution over things on the internet, right? And it's basically a compressed version of that in some way or other.
Yeah.
The simplest version would be just a probability distribution over a single token or a single word. And so it's really just an encoding of the probability distribution, and to the extent that the probability distribution reflects the diversity of what humans produce, it's the same degree, right? And then you can generate output that's just the most likely token, or you can do some average token or something like that. And sure, that's a lot less diverse than the distribution, but somehow the model encodes the distribution, and you should be able to elicit that, right? And like
good. So this gets back to point number one, or one point from yesterday, which is models are miscalibrated with respect to the human distribution. So they are much more sharply peaked than actually a human distribution should be. And that is sort of a function of the way that they're trained, especially post-training.
I mean, at temperature 0, that's the model response, basically, right? Or the model token, that's the toy version.
Yeah, okay. So at temperature 0, they are deterministic. So they're definitely much more peaky. I guess what I would say is like temperature allows you to turn up this knob that gets you to whatever level of entropy or diversity you want. The question is, are you hitting human level quality while you get there? I'll show you a plot that doesn't have human level quality, but actually does sort of do this, what is the entropy versus quality trade-off? And it ends up being different for different models, which is interesting, sort of a substantial trade-off.
But within the toy version that I just described, there is in some sense a correct temperature that reproduces the original probability distribution.
No, because post-training is miscalibrated. So if you do this, there's studies that do versions of this with base models versus post-trained models, and you find very different entropy quality trade-offs. Like the base models give you high entropy at high quality. The instruction-tuned ones are better at instruction following, obviously, but they get much lower entropy because post-training and reinforcement learning sort of spikes these distributions up.
Yeah.
And you kind of qualitatively see this. Like I'll show you one explanation for the results that I'm going to show you later. Is like some of the models in our sample are more heavily post-trained than others, and you see very different trade-offs that they made.
And for the foundation models, it's the must be a standard thing, right? That there is like a temperature that just reproduces the original probability distribution if it's correct.
Yeah, I think it depends on the precise training objective. You have to reproduce the parameter that was used in the original training objective. which is usually one.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So then I will show you some, ooh, that's another one. Okay, so I will a little more formally tell you how I'm going to test this. So what I would like to do is say, for any model, you take some input theta, which encodes the prompt, it encodes the decoding parameters, whatever you want. And for a language model M, you get a distribution over outputs from that model. And if I were to write down formally what my hypothesis is, let's come up with some distance measure that captures sort of inversions and rankings. And then what I want to say is that asking different prompts to the same model produces smaller distances than asking the same prompt to different models. Okay, it's kind of hard to see, unfortunately, but there's theta prime here, M and M prime over here. So in other words, within model distance is going to be smaller than across model distance. Yeah.
Do you know like how much watermarking these companies is creating this as they do is token if somebody's trying to assume their model, they can detect.
So all of the models I'm going to use are open weight, and I don't think any of them have watermarking built into them. Yeah, and actually, as a sort of aside, it is hard to do things the way that I'm going to do here with closed source models, because you need to be able to sample efficiently from them like thousands of times in order to get reasonably good confidence intervals around anything. And it is especially hard to do that with big models if you don't control the sampling.
Because of the cost.
Yeah, the cost is high. You can do a lot better caching locally if you're doing this with open weight models in a way that's kind of hard to do with closed source models. Yeah.
This might be a technical comment, but your expression for the distance is like it's only evaluating the distance between the models at one of the two thetas.
Yeah.
And I think there's like a more general statement that one could make, which is actually looks like a super modularity.
Okay.
But that might give you some like notion of what kind of functions you want this distance to look like. So please ignore it, but there's something a little arbitrary about the definition you're giving.
Yeah, this is, I'll show you sort of the more complete version of this in a second, which is more general than what I'm showing here. This is sort of a stylized view of what we're about to do.
But it's also all depends on what the thetas are. No?
Yeah, absolutely. So you trust me that I tried hard with a bunch of thetas. And so here's what I actually did. Every block here is going to be a different language model. You can see that these are all the ones that we're using. You can kind of guess when I ran the study based on the numbers associated with the models here. Within these, I'm going to have 33 rows and 33 columns within each of these blocks, corresponding to 11 different prompts across 3 different temperatures that I'm using for each of these models. Each square in the intersection is going to represent the distance between that model and with that prompt and temperature versus a different model with that prompt and temperature. Okay. So I'm just going to show you what this full matrix looks like, but before I do, the thing to know is that if this hypothesis is correct, you should expect this matrix to have sort of a block structure, right? You should see high similarity on these block diagonals and then low similarity off that. Okay, and so that's, I would argue, kind of what you see here. You have some nice block structure, you see high self-similarity here, and then kind of noise coming out there. Okay, and to quantify what I mean by this is the block structure we were looking for. If you just run like a spectral clustering on this, you get exact recovery of the 6 clusters that you find or that correspond to the 6 models that you have. Okay. And if you just sort of inspect that spectral embedding that you get out of this, you find that, yes, sort of these are all one model over here, those are all one model over there. There appears to be overlap here. That's just because I'm forced to project into 2 dimensions, but actually they are in fact completely separable. You notice that these 2 models are actually quite close to each other. That's because they are 2 iterations of the same series of models. And so in some sense, like those are closer than other pairs of models. Okay. So I'll argue that like this is sort of the evidence that we're going to work off of that says actually this is a reasonable interpretation of what's going on here. That input variation doesn't really seem to change too much about the rankings over alternatives that these models give you. And this might be a mechanism that we can use to sort of microfound the notion of homogenization. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is basically say, let's assume that this fact is true. let's assume that I change the inputs, doesn't change the ranking over alternatives. Let's now write down a theory model of what happens when you compete using these models. Okay, and so here's what my theory model is going to be. So let's say I show up, I have my language model over here, and I give it some input. It's going to give me a ranking over alternatives. I can change my input a little bit, and it'll change the distribution over those alternatives that I get, but it won't change their ranking. That's going to be the key property that I'm going to use here. And if somebody else shows up, as long as they're using the same language model, they'll get the same ranking, maybe a different distribution. Okay, and the game that they're going to play is each person is going to sample from their distribution, and if they pick different things, they're going to be happy. If they pick the same thing, they're going to be sad. Okay, so this is just a very simple market with collisions as your externals. And of course, if this person were to pick a different language model, they might get a totally different ranking over alternatives. So that's going to be the sort of basic theory model structure that we're going to work in.
And so then just trying to connect back to the training of data then. So there, I mean, it seems like it's really a theory of post-training, or like that whatever corporate guidelines, OpenAI versus whatever X or whoever implements, it's like what's inducing the homogenization.
So I would break it up into two things. I would say the particular training data that they choose to use dictates what that sort of ranking of alternatives ends up being. The fact that there is a single kind of hard to change ranking over alternatives seems to just be a fact about language models that is maybe not so specific to any particular post.
But like assuming that they're all kind of the base models trained on the entire internet, they're all more or less reproducing the entire internet.
So then they might all share this, whatever sort of ranking over alternatives would be the sort of
which would be the human
distribution.
But what's then a lot more collapsed is like whatever the post-training asks for, right? And then Elon Musk has his preferences of what it's supposed to be. And
good, yeah. So the thing that I'm going to try to separate out here is I'm going to say you are allowed to sort of strategically choose whatever distribution you want, as long as it obeys some ranking constraint. So it could be very diffuse, as long as everything is properly ordered. So I'm going to separate out like the fact that it is very spiky from the fact that the information content or the ranking is hard to change. Does that make sense? So formally what I'm going to say is you have some finite universe of things that the model can say. Each of those things has some value. And every person gets to choose whatever strategy they want, which is going to be sort of temperature, prompt, whatever you want. And that is going to induce some distribution over the alternatives. And the only constraint that I'm going to make is that for all people using the same model, their ranking over the alternatives is the same. One person might have a uniform distribution. One person might put all the mass on item number 1 and 0 everywhere else. So the spikiness is not what I'm constraining, just the information content in terms of the ranking. Okay, and the game is going to be very simple. Everyone samples from their distribution, and the fewer people sample the same thing as you, the happier you're going to be. So the more sort of collisions there are, the worse off you are.
this is a world with one single entity.
For now, you can do this with when people are competing across multiple ones. So here's like, if you view the marketing application as the one that I'm interested in here, you can imagine like marketers from Coke and Pepsi are both asking ChatGPT for marketing campaigns. And so when you actually ask ChatGPT, here are 3 slogans it gave me. Fizz up your life, where bubbles meet bliss, and elevate every sip. I'm going to say that they have some different values here. And let's say that this is like the demand induced by each of these slogans, and if people have the same slogan, they'll just split that demand. The model that we're going to have here is they basically are going to choose a distribution over these 3 slogans. And that's going to be sort of implicitly chosen by how they use ChatGPT and play the game based on that. So, I have Coke is going to assign probabilities P1, P2, P3 over here, and Pepsi is going to assign some probabilities over the alternatives over there. And so the probability that they have a collision, if they in this event that P1 and Q1 hits, then each of them is going to split the demand. Social welfare, I'm going to say here is 3 because that's like the sum of the players' utilities. If they instead choose different slogans, social welfare might be higher. Right? So there's not a fixed social welfare here. It would be better for both firms, better socially, if they in fact do choose different things. Okay. So the first question you might have here is, in this very, very simple setup, what does equilibrium look like? What is socially optimal behavior? Are they the same things? And if not, what is the difference between them? You can work out the math here, and you find that at equilibrium, it's sort of 80% over here, 20% over here, and nobody chooses the last. So you got zero probability minus of the last slogan. And that is not the socially optimal thing to do. Socially optimal thing to do is actually to diversify a bit more. Okay. And so already you start to see a little bit of intuition for what this is getting at. That when people behave strategically, there's sort of a tragedy of the common effect here where they over sort of index on the higher value options when it would be socially optimal if both of them kind of went further out into the tail. And that's going to emerge as a theme that we see here. Okay, so I'm going to summarize where we've been so far and then show you some results from this model. So the summary is there's a bunch of items, each of them has some value. Your utility depends on the congestion over that item. And your strategy has to be some probability distribution that obeys this ranking constraint. Okay. A few facts about this game. One is that there are always equilibria here. There's always a symmetric pure strategy equilibrium. There are also mixed equilibria, asymmetric equilibria. I'm not going to talk about them, but you can show that in the limit, the asymmetric equilibria approximate the symmetric equilibria. The other fact that makes this game kind of fun mathematically to analyze and made my life a lot easier is that when we're actually only working with a single AI model, which basically means they all obey exactly the same ranking constraint, you can just assume without loss of generality that the model is correct in the sense that it truly ranks all of the alternatives by their value. Okay. Question before I get into the results? So this is my sort of stylized model of what it looks like to compete when everybody's using the same generative AI model.
But the entire same logic would be true if you had the same, I don't know, the same marketing people coming through the same training.
Good, yeah. So if you think that like marketing people coming through the same training always kind of prefer this slogan over that slogan over that slogan, yeah, then you would have some sort of homogeneity there. All right, so this particular sort of ranking assumption, I think applies or is a reasonable description of what AI models are doing. It is not limited to AI models, nor is it an accurate description of how AI models truly behave in the world, but I think that it is like a reasonably good stylized assumption.
It's not a story about why AI would be more homogeneous than humans.
No, I think that gets boiled down to, does AI obey this constraint more than humans do? And I guess the fact that I can show you is that different AI models do not respect this constraint with respect to each other, right? This is more of a sort of within model than across model constraint. Yeah.
And is the kind of violation of the welfare theorems here that they have like market power, that in this game they think about how their choice affects the other guy?
Yes, everything is at Nash equilibrium, and so.
But so like if you took the n of the number of players as it increased,
yep,
eventually sort of everyone would be doing this statistical ensemble, and so you would just want to do it as well. And so I can think about this inefficiency as being related to like markups or something.
Why related to markups?
Well, like I guess just what I'm trying to figure out is like you have something which looks like a price, right? Which is this congestion.
Yeah, you get these shadow prices out of.
And so like normally pecuniary externalities don't generate welfare losses, but you showed us an example where it is inefficient.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to figure out like what is different from the welfare theorems. And I think the answer is the market power. That they have two players instead of like a continuum of price takers.
So you can take the number of players to infinity and you still see a welfare gap. And then maybe the difference is there are no actual prices, there are no transfers, right? There's simply play in equilibrium. Basically one thing that you can show is that if you sort of start with socially optimal behavior, like you can just compute what is socially optimal, you can start with that. What is the sort of single player deviation incentive from there? It is actually to concentrate. Right? It is to sort of overexploit things at the head of the distribution and underexploit things in the tail of the distribution. And so you do end up with a constant welfare, potential welfare loss in the limit. And turns out the numbers too, which I'll show you in a second. Another thing to know about this game is that it's actually a potential game, which means that if you just let players best respond to each other sequentially, you will eventually converge to this equilibrium. Okay, so result number one, which sort of you can do the theory for, I won't take you through too much of the details, is that the more competition you have, so the more players are playing this game, the more diverse your equilibria should be. So in the 2-player game, I might have very concentrated distributions. As I increase the number of players in this market, they're going to have to adopt more and more diverse strategies. So intuitively, like more and more people are trying to overexploit what's at the head of the distribution. They're being forced further and further out into the tail. What I mean by more diverse equilibria is a sort of, if you're interested in the math behind this, the relevant property to think about here is majorization, which is sort of a notion of how spread out a vector is relative to another. So you can think of P majorizes Q if P is sort of much more concentrated towards the head and Q is more spread out. And if you have P majorizes Q, then it's lower entropy than Q, basically for any measure of entropy that you want. Okay, and so that is what I mean when I say more diverse equilibria. I mean literally you can sort of transport mass rightward from P to Q as you increase the number of players. Okay. So that's the statement here. If you have the n-player equilibrium majorized to the n+1 player equilibrium for all that. You can also kind of do this in the language of stronger and stronger congestion. So if the congestion function itself gets stronger, again, you get more and more diverse equilibrium. Despite that, you also find that optimal strategies are always going to be more diverse than your equilibrium. So more competition is going to get players to be more and more diverse, but wherever you are, it would be even better if they diversify further for society. And the last thing I'll tell you about this is, when I say even better, you could ask how much better would it be if you could force everybody to play in a socially optimal manner as opposed to at equilibrium, and the answer is going to be always within a factor of 2. If you're interested, there's a long line of game theory we're called valid utility games. This turns out to also be a valid utility game, which gives you this result. And you can show its type. You can construct a bunch of instances or a family of instances that get you to exactly this value. Okay, so qualitatively, we've learned a few things. Competition gives you more diversity. Diversity of optimal behavior is greater than equilibrium diversity, but the social consequences cannot be too large. And the last thing that I think is sort of interesting is, and we'll show you how it bears out in some of the experiments, is let's try to take the view of, well, people don't have to all use the same model. They could choose from a menu of models. And you could ask, what is the market share of one model going to be relative to another? And so a model is to say basically every model is like a permutation over the items, and then everyone has to pick a distribution that is well ordered according to that permutation. The thing that I thought was sort of a toy result here is that which model gets the most market share is going to depend on how much competition there is. So there can in principle exist a model that gets a lot of market share under low competition, but actually goes to 0 market share when there's a lot of competition, right? So it's very good in a small market, but very bad in a big market. This is theoretically possible, and I thought it was just sort of a nice, interesting, theoretically possible thing. I'm going to show you weirdly that it ends up being kind of true in this setting, and I'll speculate as to why. Okay, so the implication here is like there isn't really a single dimensional notion of model quality when it comes to competitive settings. So it really just depends on the market that you're in. All right, so this is my picture. If there's one person in the world, they're going to choose this model over here. There's lots of people that choose the other one. And the way I'm going to sort of validate everything that I've told you is basically do this exercise of actually just playing categories with large language models and seeing what happens. Okay, and it turns out that all of the results that I've shown you on the theory side will exactly apply in this empirical setting. The thing that I'm going to allow people to be strategic about is the temperature that they're choosing. I would love to be able to do the version of this where people can be strategic about their prompt as well. This is hard to do. Just from a sort of equilibrium finding in the space of prompts is much harder than equilibrium finding in the space of real numbers. So if anybody has ideas on statistically how you would actually do that, please tell me. And so, okay, you get the first result kind of for free that just says, as you have more players in this game, the equilibrium temperature goes up. The socially optimal temperature is always even higher. So the sort of arrows pointing up are equilibrium temperatures, the arrows pointing down are socially optimal.
Does this allow for incorrect answers actually?
Yeah, so you get 0 points if your answer is incorrect.
And that's included here.
Yes. Yeah. Both for socially optimal play and equilibrium.
I mean, that's kind of interesting from a bigger picture point of view, right? Where you're, I mean, part of the reason, presumably, why post-training happens is because there's a lot of bad content on the internet, right? There's a lot of whatever, hate speech and child porn, whatever. And you presumably want to filter that out of your responses. And so part of the homogenization is kind of intended, but, which I guess in a very standard way is reflected in wrong answers here.
Yeah, and I'll show you what that explicit trade-off looks like between like wrong answers and diverse answers in a second. Okay, that confirms some of those theory results. The thing that I found sort of more surprising was that the better model here is actually going to depend on how much competition there is. So what that means is if you had just the one-player game, the best model is this particular Llama 3.1. It gives you a valid answer 90+% of the time. But as you have more and more players, it doesn't do a good job of sampling correct answers into the tail. And actually, models that were worse to begin with, in this particular case, this phi model was the worst to begin with, actually ends up being the best when there are many, many players in this game. And so your intuition here should be something like, this model is really good at finding correct answers, even out into the tail where nobody else is really looking. Whereas this model over here, one shot gives you a valid answer most of the time, but doesn't have a second best answer. It's really good in the head of the distribution, but not in the tail. So this is the sense in which it's not actually single dimensional. If there's more competition, you want a model that's better out into the tail. Now, it could have been the case that one model sort of dominated everywhere. It just happens to be the case that it doesn't. And this is what I meant by looking at trade-offs. So this is trying to draw the trade-off space between, on the x-axis, entropy of the response distribution, and on the y-axis, correctness. And each of these circles here is a different temperature that I'm sort of turning up the knob on. On the left-hand side here, you see that maybe these profiles all look kind of the same. This one definitely starts off as the most accurate, and then you can kind of trade off accuracy for entropy for all of them. The thing that I find particularly interesting is let's filter, when we calculate entropy, let's just filter out all the incorrect answers first and see how much entropy remains. So how much of that entropy is coming from valid answers versus invalid answers. And you actually see very different shapes to these curves. Okay, so this Llama 3.1 model sort of tails off very quickly. So there is additional entropy coming into the distribution, but it's largely coming from invalid or incorrect answers. If you only look at the valid answers, it's not really able to add entropy to the distribution beyond what it already is. Whereas this phi model over here is actually able to maintain like a pretty high level of accuracy way out into the tail and continue to increase its entropy at the same time. Now, when I said anecdotally, both Llama 3.1 and Llama 3.2 did undergo sort of more post-training than the phi model over here. Phi 3.5 was like a relatively small model from Microsoft. It's sort of a toy experiment. Llama 3.1 was Meta's attempt to produce a language model that people are actually going to use in practice. And so it was much more heavily post-trained. And that is my interpretation for why it sort of has a much more narrow or much lower entropy distribution out to the valid tail. This is just kind of a hypothesis, though. This is not something I've been able to really test. I don't know how to test that.
But anyway, the post-training should drop more of the incorrect answers.
And that's why it's dropping incorrect answers over here. Llama 3.2, despite being a successor, this particular Llama 3.2 model is much smaller than the other models in the sample, which is why it kind of starts way lower. But this model is doing a very good job at giving you one correct answer. All right, so post-training has worked in this kind of regime, but it also has a negative consequence somewhere in this regime, which is what the theory
is not temperature one.
This is the temperatures. These are like 0.05 increments all the way. Each circle is like a 0.05 increment. So you can, I think, yeah, it goes up to like somewhere in the 1.5 to 2.
So really, what the original model should be targeting is like accuracy at temperature one, right?
Maybe. I mean, if you think the thing is going to be used at a temperature of 0 in a not very competitive setting, then you actually do want it to do really well at low temperature, right? So it's not clear if this is, accuracy out into the tail is useful if you think you're going to be competing quite a lot with people using the same model. But if you don't think that's going to happen, then maybe you actually don't really care
Yeah,
about
but
it.
more like in a mechanical way when we run the gradient training.
You're saying what should the sort of temperature?
What is the objective function of the original training process?
I don't know off the top of my head, nor am I actually sure that they've told us. Okay, so this is sort of what I think is the interesting finding in all of this, or one interesting finding in all of this, is that some models just have better tails than others. And your takeaway should be that there isn't really a single dimensional measure of quality across these models. Some models are better in some conditions, others are better in other conditions. It depends on the conditions under which they're operating. Okay, so I think I'm gonna finish on time or even early, so we can have some discussion. So these are my takeaways from what I've talked through so far. One, externalities appear to increase diversity. We had this, this RCT in which we seem to find that was the case. If you write that down as a theory model, that implication goes through as well. It's not necessarily clear to me that this is a good thing, right? Do we want diversified slop? Again, this is sort of is it quality? Is it homogeneity? What is the thing that we object to here when we do call it slop? We find that models are at least somewhat heterogeneous, so that they do behave differently from each other. We'd rather have a sort of diverse ecosystem of models than just a single model powering everything. And maybe that's something that we can or should take advantage of. And then something I've been thinking more and more about recently is the more design problem. What role can or should AI play in creative production? So if we think of one way that information is being filtered through us is through these models that are shaping what we do in these co-creation processes, what should that interaction look like? How should we structure it? And I think one view of the world that I would like is, instead of a world where we're all kind of doing the same thing with the same models, maybe it would be nice if we had a bunch of different funky models that are all doing different things, and they have different strengths, they have different weaknesses, but all of that is hopefully complementary. Okay, so that's all I had planned for today. Thank you again for organizing to both of you. And yeah, looking forward to questions.